Pitchers rattled as the front door to the cabin was kicked open by a strong foot, followed by a set of footsteps made by heavy feet coated by thick leather boots. As they made their way through the front hall, a hand grabbed the almost broken knob and slammed the door behind him without looking behind him, creating a loud echo into the empty cabin. A lantern slammed onto the floor with force, but not hard enough to cause it to break. That would simply be terrible should it break. An empty gun was thrown through the air, crashing to the floor with a loud clanking sound in the empty hall, rolling a few feet before stopping on the floor. The heavy footsteps returned to the air of the cabin as the hunter made his way through, carrying a large leather bag on his back that looked to be containing something large and round. Upon reaching his shed, aka his carving room, where he would skin and prepare his animal victims, he took off the leather bag and threw it onto the counter where his tools were already set up. With a wheeze, the hunter grabbed hold of the bag and opened it, reached inside and pulled out a dead raccoon, the most recent kill he collected from his time out hunting on both the ground and his watchtower. He gave an annoyed snort, but grabbed a knife as well as what looked like large potato peelers, before going ham on the dead animal that rested on the counter, peeling the skin off first, then setting it to the side to be used for taxidermy. He took the knife and sliced down the animal's chest, opening it up to reveal the organs. The hunter snorted again and pulled his leather gloves up, then buried his hands in the dead animal's guts, pulling out each organ with brute force before carelessly tossing them to the side. Blood sprayed on the counter, and some hit the hunter's jacket and the sack that covered his face, turning it dark red. His gloves were coated already, but that didn't stop him from roughly grabbing hold of the bones that were broken apart in his quest to grab the organs. The hunter reached out to his set of tools and grabbed hold of bone cutters, finding that brute strength alone wasn't going to be enough. It was quite difficult, even for someone like him, but it wasn't impossible. All it took was several good shoves on the tool to get the bones to break into pieces, till they were small enough to be pulled out of the chest wound and tossed aside. By the time the hunter was done with the raccoon, the counter was covered in blood, organs, and bones, things that would need to be cleaned up before the next kill. It was quite a mess, but the hunter couldn't be bothered to clean it up as his house was already a mess to begin with, and he didn't feel bad about adding on top of it. He huffed and set his tools down to the side, then gathered up the flesh and organs before heading to his kitchen. As he walked down the hall, blood dripped from the skinned animal and organs, staining the wooden floor red. The scent of iron filled the air and the hunter's nostrils with each breath he took through his nose. He would have simply breathed through his mouth, as that would have been 10 times easier and faster than what he was doing now. However, the wound in his head, which marked the bullet hole in the old potato sack that covered his deformed face, made by his own shotgun during his failed suicide attempt after the signal tower first corrupted the Pale City, really did a number on his face to nearly break his jaw and rip away parts of his throat. With a shake of his head, the hunter forced the thoughts aside in favor of throwing the meat on the kitchen counter and grabbing several supplies from the kitchen counters and drawers. He first chucked a light blue box with a set of ice cubes on the front, on the ground, then grabbed half of the bloody organs and the meat of the skinned heap that used to be the dead raccoon, dropping it into the open box, then closing it up tight before kicking it into a corner, creating a thud into the silent air that would be broken by the sounds of the flies that swarmed around the dirty kitchen. With that task done, the hunter set a greased plate and set the remaining organs on it, turning on the stove as he prepared to cook them. Honestly, he wasn't the best cook in the world, but that didn't mean he would burn his entire house down if he cooked any meals at all, or made his meat more pink than brown or something like that. In fact, he seemed to be better at this task than anyone, given that he never burned the cabin to the ground, and actually managed to cook what he intended to cook. It took a few minutes, or probably an hour. Honestly, he wasn't keeping time, but the organs finally turned a dark brown to signal they were done. In an instant, the cooked organs were taken off the stove and put on a plain white plate he had forgotten to put away last dinner, as evident by the old bloodstains marking the top. The hunter took the plate and carried it back into the halls, heading toward a door that rested on the left wall a few feet away from the living room, intending to open the door and head downstairs to place the plate inside the room where he was keeping Mono and Six captive. He was surprised to find the door already wide open. Against himself, the hunter paused in his tracks, almost dropping the plate in the process as he brought a hand up to his head to scratch it. That door wasn't open before he left to go hunting, wasn't it? Surely he would have remembered if he left the door open or closed, right? The hunter wasn't the most organized person in the world, he admitted, but even he could remember if he closed the door or not. Well, sometimes. Did he forget to shut the door before he went out to hunt? After a few seconds of thinking, the hunter let out a muffled sigh through his sack and rolled his eyes. Whatever. Even if he hadn't shut the first door, the children still wouldn't have been able to escape his cabin otherwise, as there was still a door blocking their exit, and with how weak they had gotten from the lack of food over the last days. Yes, he would feed the two troublesome children, but it wasn't much, considering how disobedient they both were. So, with a confident snort, the hunter descended the stairs into his basement and headed over to a wooden door that kept Mono and Six captive and reached out a hand to open the door, only to notice two things different about the basement. One, there was a large hole resting at the bottom of the door, with pieces of wood resting on the floor next to the axe that Mono used to break down the door to get into Six's prison. 2. There was a faint scent of iron in the air. Blood scent. It was faint at first, but with each passing second, the scent grew stronger, till it threatened to overrule the rotten smell of dead bodies killed by the gun the hunter always carried on him. The hunter didn't dare mistake the coppery smell for anything else, for he knew it better than the back of his own head that was cloaked by a dirty sack. Blood. Down here? In his basement? In his cabin? Yes, the cabin itself smelled like rotten food and dead bodies and blood as it was. But never once in his goddamn deformed life did he remember putting something bloody like bloody meat down in the children's prison. In fact, whatever food the hunter provided to the children was veggies and cooked non-bloody meat, since he wasn't entirely heartless. Something was wrong. His guts were telling him that, no doubt about it. But the question of what was wrong was left in the air. Setting the plate down, the hunter kicked the door open with such force that the old handle got stuck in the wall and stayed there. If he still had his eyes free, they would have gone wide with surprise at the sight of the large blood-stained and charred bones lying in the middle of the room. It still looked fresh, as if the puddle had just been dropped into the room to stain the floor, like a coat of discarded paint being left there by a painter who could care less about his job. The bones were pure white and shined dimly in the light of the moon, as if they'd been painted in a shimmering white paint, or they were mere diamonds or bright silver found by pirates. But there was no denying that these were human bones. But from where? The hunter had never moved any of his human victims from the woods to his cabin. They were all netted up in his traps far out in the woods till he could properly bring them to be stuffed. So how in the hell could human meat have been brought into the cabin by anyone, since the wilderness were so isolated that even the hunter had trouble finding prey whenever he went to hunt? So how could someone have brought the children meat? Human meat at that. And where were the children anyway? Did they? Before the hunter's mind could finish the question, his eyes caught sight of two sets of little bloody footprints, heading from the middle of the room over to the hole made in the door, then into the hallway of the basement. In an instant, the hunter turned away from the giant blood stain in the room, and he stumbled into the hall like a drunken man after too many shots, following the little footprints from the hall and up the stairs with steps that would frighten the children who dared to hide in the wilderness from the twitchy viewers of the Pale City. The trip upstairs only took a few seconds, thanks to the man's larger legs and feet, and the hall went by in such a flash that even the hunter almost crashed into the wall of his cabin, and the scent of iron went by unnoticed. But the smell soon hit the hunter's nostrils, with the same level of force as before, not letting up for a second till he reached his dining area. The door was kicked to the side as well, its handle getting stuck in the wall and staying there. His running came to a screeching halt as he stared at the remains of his former family on the dirty dining table. He now knew how the children escaped, and what they had turned into. And Lord above, it wasn't a simple monster like the ones in the Pale City. No, these monsters were older, stronger, and more dangerous. With an angry growl, the hunter turned around and sprinted back to the front of the cabin, grabbed his gun and his lantern that were still sitting on the wooden floor just in case, then stormed out to the back and kicked the door wide open, shining his light into the woods, finding no sight of the two child escapees. The hunter stomped down the wooden steps of his porch and loaded his gun with a click before heading into the woods. He didn't know where the two children were now, as they could have made it several miles into the woods right after they had transformed, and this could depend on when they escaped. But given how much meat they had devoured, the supernatural powers they had no doubt gained would have given them a head start. One thing was for sure, these were not weak children anymore. They were a threat to not just him, but everyone else in the Pale City and the folks above the maw. They were now Wendigos, and anyone was their prey. Regardless of how small and weak Mono and Six seemed, they were anything but that anymore. Though the hunter didn't have too much knowledge on the Wendigo legend, he still had to find his prey and blow them away before they consumed more human flesh and became more powerful monsters who would turn the Pale City from a ruined city to a bloody hunting ground.